Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Banky, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Development here at Forward Community Investments, and I would like to welcome you to today's presentation titled Race to the Polls, Everything You Need to Know to Prioritize Racial Justice This Election Season with Winona Wolf and Erica Nelson of Kids Forward. Forward Community Investments is a community developmental financial institution that serves the state of Wisconsin. We are an investor, connector, and advisor for organizations and initiatives that are reducing racial inequities and socioeconomic disparities in communities. We are able to accomplish this through community financing, community development services, and grant making. For more information regarding FCI and all that we do, I invite you to visit our website, www.forwardci.org. At this time, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes with you. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website for you to share with your colleagues following the presentation. In addition to the recording, we will also be posting the slides that we'll be going through during the webinar for your reference. An email will be sent out to all participants probably early next week with all of this information, so be on the lookout for that. We will also be taking questions throughout the presentation. We want to make this more of a conversational presentation than kind of a lecture, so feel free to ask any questions that you have. You can do that using the chat box or the questions box, and I'll be interacting with folks at that point. So if we don't ask your question right away, hang tight. We'll get to that, and like I said, we're trying to make this as conversation as possible. So now on to the presentation. As I'm sure most of you are aware, there's a very crucial election coming up in a couple weeks. FCI has decided to act and ensure that our partner organizations have the tools and knowledge that can be passed along to all voter-eligible citizens that will assist them in registering and voting in the upcoming election. It is also critical to note that the politicians that are elected during this election shape the policies that affect everyone. Do not expect someone to speak up for you. You need to speak up for yourself. Once again, thank you all for joining us. And then at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Winona and Erica.
Hi, thank you, Tom. We're really happy to be here. My name is Erica Nelson, and I am the Race to Equity Director for Kids Forward.
Hi, everyone. This is Winona Wolf. Tom, thank you for having us here today, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. I just want to be sure everything is technical is working. You can see our screen, our presentation.
Yep, I see it loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. So just a little overview before we start. First off, we're going to be telling you a little bit about Kids Forward for those of you who may not be familiar with us. And then we're going to talk about our Race to the Polls campaign and why we started that campaign. And specifically, we're going to talk about the racial disparities that exist here in Wisconsin. And then we'll move into why the election matters and why it matters regarding these issues and what you and your organizations can do to encourage your clients, your coworkers, your colleagues, your family to get out and vote and make a difference in this year's election. So first off, Kids Forward works to inspire action and promote access to opportunity for every child, every family, and every community in Wisconsin. We envision a Wisconsin where every child thrives. So some of the ways that we stand up for kids, we advocate for investments in a child's earliest years, healthier kids and families, equitable communities, strengthening Wisconsin's workforce, a level playing field on taxes, and a fair justice system for our youth. This summer, in addition to all the work that we do related on specific issues, we launched Race to the Polls, an electoral advocacy campaign that encourages Wisconsin citizens to vote and to prioritize racial justice when they go to the polls. Because we need leaders who will engage with Wisconsin's communities of color, amplify their voices, and work to advance policies that promote racial justice. Our schools, our communities, and our economy will be better when every person in the state has access to opportunity. But in order to achieve this, our lawmakers must stand up for racial justice and advance policies that promote racial equity. Because our future is diverse, engaged, compassionate, equitable, inclusive, healthy, factual, and thriving. And we need leaders who will engage with Wisconsin's communities of color. Race to the Polls is for the people, by the people. People who are ready to make racial justice a priority. People who are ready to vote for candidates who will talk about issues affecting people of color. People who will hold elected officials accountable and support policies that will undo the many unjust policies and practices that exist in our state and throughout our nation. So we all have a role to play in addressing these problems, and there is no better place to start than at the polls. Our schools and our economy will be a much better place when everyone in the state has access to opportunity. But we like to think of Race to the Polls as more than just a campaign. It's a movement to make racial justice a priority right now in the next coming weeks and on November 6th. But we also hope that this movement goes beyond Election Day, because we know that we need to also be holding leaders accountable when they're in office. And we need to be talking about race. We need to be inclusive, and communities of color need to be addressed and heard and be incorporated into the process of public policy making.
Yeah, and I would think that to add to Winona, that prioritizing racial justice and folks of color and communities of color across the state is not a zero-sum game, but everybody wins when you're in a system or in a state that leaves no one behind. We will be one of the strongest states in the nation if everyone is taken care of and when our leaders strive to advance equity.
All right, so a little about the campaign itself and where it exists and how it exists. Race to the Polls is mostly a digital campaign. We have a fantastic looking website at www.racetothepolls.org. And on that website is an opportunity or a place for people to pledge and promise and commit to making racial justice a priority in these coming weeks and beyond. People are also able to share their stories on the website. They can get valuable resources about the election. In addition to holding space in the digital world, Race to the Polls is also working on the ground and in communities by making sure that people in all parts of our state and all communities are engaged and ready to vote. We have been circulating pledge cards throughout communities. People can share their story on the card, they commit to vote, and then we've gotten a ton of these out and back to us, and then next week we will be dropping them in the mail. So people get a little reminder that they will be, that they should go and vote on Tuesday, November 6th. One important aspect about this campaign in its development and how we've been really mindful in what it looks like, and that it is a very inclusive campaign. So one way we showed that was by the creation of these pledge cards, which on the pledge cards, as you can see, is the word vote in a number of languages that often go unheard here in Wisconsin, but they are the languages of communities of color. So we have Ojibwe and Hmong and Vietnamese. So Race to the Polls is a special project of Kids Forward, Race to Equity, and the Wisconsin Budget Project. But before we go further, I think I just want to share with you a little about why Kids Forward, as a public policy and an advocacy organization, decided to create this campaign and have been putting a lot of energy and resource into it. And it's because as a public policy and advocacy organization, we see the importance of centering the voices and needs of communities of color in the democratic process. Through our data and policy analysis, we find over and over that alarming racial disparities exist between Wisconsin's white population and its African American, Asian American, Latinx, and Native American populations, which stem from hundreds of years of inequitable policies. In order to create a more equitable state where communities of color thrive, we must address disparities and implement policies that proactively remove the barriers facing communities of color. We need to elect individuals to public office that are committed to listening to communities of color, talking about race and racial disparities, working with communities of color to amplify their voices, and implementing equitable public policy. Our hope is that Race to the Polls can support and amplify the work of people of color and organizations committed to racial justice that have been doing this work for many, many years and doing this work before us. Everyone must play their part in making Wisconsin the best place for every child, every family, and every community, including us.
So I think one of the things we hope for in the future and coming out of the election, if folks are engaged, is that the future of Wisconsin can be built on the shared values of our history of progressivism and progress, but also to think about new shared values for the state of Wisconsin. And for Kids Forward, we envision our future as one that is diverse, engaged, compassionate, equitable, inclusive, healthy, factual, and thriving. And we hope that these are values that we can share with you and that you can sort of take ownership on and carry forward as we go into this election as well as into the future. So when we think about the issues that are facing the state, and our organization is Kids Forward, but we do think about things from the two-generational approach. Oftentimes when we think about public policy and the issues, we focus exclusively on children and youth in terms of policies and where our energy and our financial investments should go. And while that's very, very important, we also know that there are parents out there, there are grandparents, and there are families and communities. And when those parents and those grandparents and those caretakers are less stressed, less taxed, and when they are healthy, their community thrives, and above all else, their children thrive as they meet these twin challenges of work and raising these children. So it's important to think about the parents and the families, not just the children when we think about policies to promote going forward. So we just want to talk briefly, this is the state of Wisconsin, about the changing demographics and the population of the state as a whole. So the population is about 5.4 million people in the state of Wisconsin, and it consists of around 361,000 African Americans, 51,000 Native Americans, 371,000 Hispanic Latinx individuals, 148,000 Asian, but the majority of the population is white, which is 4.7 million folks. However, by the time 2042 comes around, the majority of our nation will actually be people of color. And currently in many districts in cities and urban areas throughout the state, more than 50% of the elementary school population is actually kids of color. And so it's really important when we think about our future to think about how we're aware of these different populations and be sort of culturally competent in thinking about the issues that these communities face.
Yeah, and I think one thing we want people to start rethinking is often, especially when it comes to elections, is that people really focus in on the kind of the percentage of communities of color, the number of people of color that live in the state, you know, because it can be some math and it can be talking about, you know, where you spend your time or who's talking about what, and obviously you're going to kind of lean towards talking about and to the population that has larger representation. But I think we really want to push moving away from that model, because we can no longer not listen to our communities of color or people of color or all communities here in the state, regardless of their population. You know, we are all members of this state and we all deserve, you know, opportunity and to have our voices heard, and for people to be, you know, really paying attention to our needs, because we know that the disparities that we're going to talk about shortly, you know, often have a greater impact on our communities.
Great. So one of the areas, the policy areas that Kids Forward focuses on is around healthcare. And so we're going to take a few minutes to just talk about why folks should be thinking about healthcare with a racial equity lens. So one of just simple pieces of data, not very in-depth, but For the Latinx and Native American Wisconsinites, the uninsured rate is about 4 times the rate for their white peers or counterparts. And so there is a lot of work to do in terms of increasing the insurance rate. In fact, there's if you look at everyone in the state, there are about 300,000 Wisconsinites remain uninsured. And it's really important to think about, healthy communities create a healthy and thriving Wisconsin. So that's really important to think about when you're looking at where our future is and how healthy it is. So when thinking about health insurance, we want folks and candidates in particular to think about making sure that Medicaid is strong, and that folks are not made bankrupt or economically unstable by health emergencies. So we should have strong health coverage. We should close the coverage gap. I just mentioned that about 300,000 Wisconsinites are not covered, and for Latinx and the Native population, that there's a high disparity there as well. And then we need to promote policies that allow access by reducing premiums and reducing pre-existing conditions for people to have access to health coverage. And I think that one of the things that is pressing is that people are really thinking in this election and into the future about the importance of healthcare and coverage, and these access is important for clinical health outcomes, and it's important for thinking about sort of the economic stability of communities and of the community in the future. Okay. Now we're going to move on to poverty. Poverty is an extraordinarily economic stability, and kids living in poverty and adults living in poverty is should be an issue for every resident in the state of Wisconsin. So we're just going to give you a few indicators on what that looks like. So Wisconsin's economic system has significant barriers to success for many communities of color as a result of hundreds of years of inequitable policies, which Winona talked about a little earlier on in our presentation. So currently 36% of African American people live in poverty, 28% of Native American people live in poverty, 26% of Latinx people live in poverty, 19% of Asian American people live in poverty, and 9% of white people live in poverty in the state of Wisconsin. I think there's a myriad of reasons as to why this is important. And I think that there are many children, nearly 200,000 Wisconsin children are living in poverty. And when you look at the disproportionate number of kids of color living in poverty, that is a burden that many of these communities of color face. And I think that it's important to recognize that speaking of shared values, no child in a nation or state this resource should be wanting for basic things like food, housing, and clothing. And while it may not be seemingly huge numbers of people when it comes to communities of color living in poverty, it's really important to think about the financial stability and the health of communities as the demographics of the state change. And again, I think the underlying theme for us is that when everyone is thriving, we all thrive, right? So if we've included everyone and we're looking out for those that have been historically marginalized and disadvantaged, we all benefit when everyone is doing better. So I think that we have some recommendations. And we urge candidates to increase employment and income of low-income families, and that's looking at the importance that business plays, the role that business plays in creating jobs and creating living wage, family-supporting jobs that can lift folks out of poverty. And this also includes thinking about how we create a more equitable tax policies across the state and work to sort of level the playing field with respect to that. We need to think about expanding and improving support for low-income working families of color again, to better balance the twin challenges of parenting and success on the job. This includes thinking about creating family-friendly workplaces, and increasing benefits for families, vacation, paid leave policies that support parents who need to take care of their kids, so they don't have to make the horrible and difficult choice of deciding to keep their employment or staying home with a sick child. We need to think about how transportation can support folks getting to jobs and making transportation both accessible and affordable for low-income folks and communities of color in particular. Improving the support for these families also means looking at increasing the availability of parent education, family counseling, and family preservation services, as well as the really ever-pressing need for more affordable and safe housing. So those are some of the recommendations. Oh, and closing the gender and
closing the gender and racial pay gap. We know that there's a huge gap in pay among white men and women of color, and that is something that we need to address. That's something that is, creating a huge burden on our families and our communities. And we know that communities and families would be thriving much more if there was equal pay. And there are policies and solutions that candidates can implement to start chipping away at that. And lastly, we want candidates to advocate for equitable tax policies.
Okay, so another one of the issues that the organization and Kids Forward works on is looking at early care and education across the state. And we are thinking about how this impacts children and families of color in particular. So looking at the our analysis of Wisconsin's quality rating and improvement system, this is essentially Youngstar, that this shows significant disparities in access to high quality educational programs for low-income African American kids. And consequently, the system needs an influx of funding, and particular attention needs to be paid to improving early childhood education that's of quality for families. And again, this goes back to both the two-generation strategy, the ability to stay employed by having high-quality childcare in place so that you can get to work and have a place to put your child during the day where you feel that they're safe and that they're also learning. So we have this is
No, we're okay.
okay.
Sorry, it's the wrong heading. Sorry,
I got confused. But we have recommendations for candidates as well with respect to looking at early childhood education with a racial equity lens, and that is eliminating disparities in access to high quality programs for low income children, which we just talked about briefly. Support the child care workforce. We need to increase the pay for those teachers who are taking care of these children in these spaces. They're often severely underpaid, averaging about $10 per hour if you look at child care workers across the state. And many of these providers are people of color, or they serve children of color. And it's really important that it's not only that the kids are coming in there, but the people that are taking care of them are adequately compensated with a living wage for this extraordinarily important work that they're doing. I mean, much of the recent science and conversations around brain development talk about the importance of investment in children and their early development from 0 to 8 in terms of thinking about how their future success will be, their future well-being outcomes, whether that's education and the like. So we want to work for these children to eliminate food deserts and invest in healthy, accessible outdoor space and age-appropriate and culturally appropriate activities. So, you know, kids should have access to outdoor space that's safe and inviting, and they should also have access to healthy, developmentally sustaining foods. And then we need to, I think this is also really important, and this has been a big discussion with respect to the communities around healthcare and in thinking about our justice systems, criminal justice and juvenile justice. There's a lot of conversation about promoting and investing in trauma-informed care, and that should also be applicable to thinking about what young children need and how their various needs should be met. So thinking about an investment in trauma-informed care should be part of the future.
Hey, Winona and Erica, we did get a question roll through, and just kind of wanted to keep this interaction going. So we had an individual ask, they're interested in equitable tax policies. Do you have any examples of what that could look like?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're a huge advocate here at Kids Forward, and Kids Forward is also home to the Wisconsin Budget Project that does a lot of tax analysis. One big thing that we advocate for is the Earned Income Tax Credit.
And an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit for low-income families and families of color in particular. And I think also sort of looking at advocating to create a more equitable tax system generally for the state with respect to, you know, we're constantly creating tax breaks for those who are well-connected and who tend to be at the higher income levels. And much of the tax burden in the state is falling on middle-class families. And to have a strong middle class in the state, that tax burden has to be shifted. So we're advocating along those lines as well.
Yeah, and also having an understanding that, you know, our taxes are also used to invest in really great things. So looking at where there's tax breaks, not tax breaks, and whether, you know, a $20 tax break for every family in Wisconsin, is that instead of that, could we be investing in our education system at a much, you know, higher amount and bringing quality care, quality education, and strengthening our communities by making stronger investments.
Great, thank you for answering that. Just want to make a plug for if you do have any questions, keep them coming. We'll be taking breaks, and I'll be interjecting those questions throughout the presentation. So use the question or chat box, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So another one of our issues that we focus on and we strive to advocate for around social justice is protecting immigrant families in the state of Wisconsin and across the nation. So immigrants come to the United States in search of a better life, to build a strong future, and to achieve their dreams. Immigrants also bring significant contributions to Wisconsin schools, communities, and economy, contributions that are enhanced when immigrants have full access to opportunity. Most immigrants in Wisconsin are people of color, so protecting immigrant families requires Wisconsin lawmakers to stand up for racial justice. And I mean, it sounds, you know, cliche, but we are a nation of immigrants and we are a state of immigrants. And I think that not losing sight of that is really important. And so we urge...
Not entirely a nation of immigrants.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize. Not entirely. That's good correction. Thank you, Winona. Much appreciated. So we urge candidates to keep families together. Children belong with their parents, and that is true whether families arrive at the border fleeing economic hardship and violence, or living and working in Wisconsin cities, small towns, and rural areas. We should advocate for border policies that allow families to stay together when they seek asylum at the border, and block immigration enforcement that also targets law-abiding citizens. And we should make another one of the recommendations looking at immigration and policies is to make higher education affordable for all Wisconsin residents, and that's including making it accessible for undocumented youth. because they're currently undocumented youth in Wisconsin are not eligible to pay in-state tuition rates, and they have to pay a higher rate, even if they have lived in Wisconsin nearly their entire lives. So they often are forced to pay out-of-state tuition, and this again, impacts, their ability to be successful and to participate and in our overall statewide economy. Again, another place where we urge candidates to think about this is protecting young immigrants who are vulnerable to deportation by supporting and strengthening DACA, which is the Federal Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy, which temporarily has provided protections for immigrant youth. However, recently, over the last 12 months or more, the current federal administration has weakened these protections. So it's really vital that Wisconsin lawmakers affirm and strengthen DACA and preserve it, because immigrant youth are part of our community, and they need access to higher education, the ability to work, to access transportation, and to think about their future and secure their future in this state as productive residents and people in our community. We need to remove barriers to driver's licenses and allow families to access help with healthcare, food, and housing without fear of retaliation.
Yeah. And if any of you have been following the news related mostly to the gubernatorial election, and I think that the U.S. congressional election here in Wisconsin, this issue is a really big issue right now. If you tuned into the debate last Friday, they talked about it at the debate. There was questions asked. And this is exactly what we want to see happening. We want to see people holding our candidates accountable and asking about these important issues that are affecting a population of people here in our state. There's a lot of conversation around driver's license, and there's a lot of conversation about how our Wisconsin's agriculture industry is now thriving, but thriving on the backs of immigrant communities. And what are we doing as a state to honor and include and make our systems more just so these communities can thrive? We appreciate that people are talking about these issues. We appreciate that candidates are mostly talking about them. We would like to see stronger answers from candidates, and answers that address these issues and are going to make our state a more just place.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, from the Winona's comments about sort of the dairy industry, I think it's really important to, as she said, to hold politicians accountable for thinking about and answering about questions around racial equity, because the governor did have he himself celebrated the dairy industry as really important and vital to Wisconsin and our history and our culture, but failed to acknowledge the role that the immigrant population plays in making that industry successful. So I think these are the type of things that we want people to think and reflect on and ask themselves those questions, but more importantly, ask the candidates in the coming days and the coming months and the coming years. This should become part of the general dialogue about policies and structures in the state and the nation. So our last issue area is around sort of the deep end systems. Much of what we've been talking about are sort of different parts of how policymakers and what they're responsible for and the type of work that they do, from healthcare to advancing investment in early childhood to fair tax policy, et cetera, et cetera. But they also have a huge role to play in our deep end systems around things like juvenile justice and the criminal justice system. So recently, the state passed an act called Act 185, which closed Lincoln Hills and Lincoln Hills School for Boys and Copper Lake School for girls. And what is, I'll back up for a second, but Wisconsin's juvenile justice system has historically been disproportionately involved youth of color, and has had a harmful impact on their future, and sort of often exacerbates already existing historical and systemic disadvantages in access to opportunity faced by these youth. And In the case of the state, going back to the closing of Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake under Act 185, I'm sorry, this is an opportunity to ask candidates and to think about how we go forward and reform the juvenile justice system so that it does not continuously disproportionately involve youth of color in the deep end systems. We also need to think about improving Wisconsin's Second Chance Bill. The Second Chance Bill is a bill that would reform the juvenile justice system to include all 17-year-olds. Currently, 17-year-olds are put into the adult criminal justice system. And so we are hoping that the candidates will think about advocating to pass the second chance bill for 17-year-olds and put them in the juvenile justice system, but also include all 17-year-olds, as opposed to sort of right now the bill is proposed as just being a space for a second chance for 17-year-olds who are committing nonviolent and specifically narrow. It's a narrowing of the opportunity for kids to be put back into the juvenile justice system. And lastly, it's really important to think about when these reforms or these opportunities involve youth, that the youth have a voice in participating in how things will go forward, and that oftentimes when they're the most impacted, they have the best perspective on what can be done differently. And I think we need to think about how we ask candidates how they're incorporating youth and youth voice into the discussion about reforms going forward. Let's see. So we're trying to catch ourselves up to our conversation here.
So, looking and understanding all the issues that we just talked about, and I think those, really are just the tip of so many of the issues that we are seeing communities of color here in Wisconsin face, and they're just a number of them, and a sort of an idea or some recommendations related to policy. But one of the things I think we need to remember is a lot of time we hear candidates talking about some of their proposals, and oftentimes when they shift into the elected official position and are creating public policies, there's sort of this idea that a general policy will help. One policy kind of fits all. And I think one thing that we really want to stress and try to stress here at Kids Forward and through this campaign is, like, there is often going to be really needed specific policies addressed, because there are specific issues affecting communities of color that, for the Native American community, systemic issues have created certain problems and barriers, whereas it's different from community to community. So we really want candidates to, start paying attention to communities of color and start really thinking what policies and engaging with these communities, because often we know that the solution to a lot of the issues that exist within communities of color, they are also home to the answer, and they're the ones that are going to be able to best address that problem. So again, why Race to the Polls is really here and out there, encouraging people to be talking about race, encouraging voters to be, holding candidates and then eventually elected officials accountable, and telling them that we need to be talking about these really specific issues and start being inclusive and acknowledging our communities of color and the barriers that they face here in Wisconsin. Because we know that Wisconsin can do better, and Wisconsin must do better in order to be a state where every child and every community and family is thriving, and that we're all receiving the benefits of a robust economy. We need to start addressing the persistent racial disparities that plague our state. And again, we all have a role, whether it's public policy organizations, nonprofit organizations, us as leaders within these organizations, us as citizens and members of these communities and of the state, to really be engaged, to exercise our right to vote, but also be thinking about how that a vote is going to shape so much of what we do and how our communities are thriving or not thriving. So again, just an emphasis some of the things that people can do is, you know, not only can you go out and vote, but we really want to encourage organizations to be honed into these issues, and not just right now, but understand that they should be thinking about racial equity when they're working on issues. And not only should they be thinking about it or talking about it and incorporating it, but they should be doing it in a genuine way and not overlooking communities of color. We don't want, as organizations or as individuals, to be doing that, and we definitely, you know, don't want our candidates to be doing that.
So we have, through the Race to the Polls process, work to engage with organizations of color and those working to address racial disparities in order to get voters to the polls. So this is an example of a lot of the organizations that we've been partnering with in order to spread the message, to put a racial equity lens on thinking about this upcoming election. And yeah, our hope is through these partnerships that we can, you know, make it a movement and expand the reach and increase voter turnout.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, this is one of the lists that that Kids Forward, you know, created. We had some existing partnerships, but I think this is also an excellent list for, you know, many of you may already have great partnerships with these organizations, but, you know, there might be organizations on here that you haven't worked with, and I think this is a small list, but a start to looking at some organizations that are really doing great work here in Wisconsin and really addressing some of the big issues that we have here. And I think that engagement piece can turn into some really great collaborative work. And right now we just wanted to share one of the things that we're doing here at Kids Forward, and what we're able to do as a 501c3. And one of the priorities that rose out of Race to the Polls was trying to assist and support people that are on the ground, organizations of color, and what they're doing, and lend any support and help them in their work here in Wisconsin. And one of those organizations is the Wisconsin League of Conservation's Wisconsin Native Vote Program. And for those of you that may not be familiar with it, it is a program that works throughout Wisconsin, particularly on reservations throughout the state and with Native nations here. And they're really working to counter the disenfranchisement that so many Native American people have and communities have faced throughout the years. They are on the ground, on the reservation, talking about the issues that are important to the community and how they then can activate, you know, turning those issues into mobilizing people and getting to the polls and voting for candidates that are going to be champions for them, and then how they can continue working on these issues beyond the election. So we met with them, we listened to them, and we asked, you know, how could we help? And one of the things is they asked us to create a pledge card and their door hangers this year for their Get Out to Vote campaign. They played off of our original idea of having the languages of various communities of color, and this card represents the native languages of Wisconsin. I doubt there's very many people in the state that know how to say vote in Potawatomi and Menominee and Oneida and Mohegan and Ho-Chunk, but fortunately their organizers and their community really helped us out and pulled us together. So these pledge cards are out on the reservations. They're getting sent back to the Native community, reminding them to vote on November 6th. And then their organizers are leaving these door hangers on people's doors and reminding them to get out the vote so their voices can be heard and their issues hopefully can be heard by candidates, and really push candidates to be thinking about the Native community as candidates should be thinking about all of our communities of color here in Wisconsin.
Okay, so these are the seats in the state that are at stake. So just so you know, it's the governor, the lieutenant governor, the U.S. senator, the attorney general, state treasurer, secretary of state. And I think, I hope that the one thing or the few things that you've heard in the last 40 minutes or so is that there's a lot more at stake, really. There are a lot of communities and their needs and the challenges that are at stake in these elections, and and thinking about that and how these particular seats and elections can impact the well-being of those communities into the future. So there is a lot at stake going forward.
And I think oftentimes a lot of people don't, I grew up in northern Wisconsin. I grew up 4 hours away from Madison, where our thinking wasn't always about the Capitol or what was going on in the Capitol, or what our elected officials are doing. Our focus was really on our community and our families. So I think one of our goals is to get people understanding more of how these roles can have and do have a big impact on people's everyday lives. And a lot of people may be a little unclear about the Attorney General or the State Treasurer or the Secretary of State, but they do have a role to play here in our state, and they do have power and can inform public policy and shape public policy. So it's really, for people like us to understand what those mean, and then, help explain that and educate and work with other people to show the importance of these roles and why we all need to be going to the polls and casting our vote in all of these races.
We have one more quick question, if I could interject quick.
Yes.
There were some questions with regards to what you guys are actually doing with some back on a couple slides back. You had the list of organizations that you're working with and partnering with about this, and just kind of wanted a little bit more information about like what you're kind of doing. So, for instance, like with the YWCA of Madison or the League of Conservation Voters or the Black Leaders Organizing Communities. Do you have any examples that you'd like to share about what you guys are actually doing with those partners?
Yeah. So YWCA Madison, I think the partnership there was that, we share very similar missions to eliminate racism here in our state. So they provided us with a platform to talk about Race to the Polls. We had kind of a heavy presence at their big racial justice summit. We spoke in front of their crowd. We handed out the pledge cards. For the Wisconsin League of Conservation Voters is our partnership with the Native Vote program. Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin played a role in helping us better understand our 501c3 and C4 kind of compliance. Voces de la Frontera, we have been working not so much specifically on Race to the Polls, but they have been a huge, amazing partner of ours in some reports that we are going to be releasing on driver's license and the need for us to allow all immigrants to have access to that. Black Leaders Organizing for Communities was, going down and just better understanding what is going on in their community and seeing what support we could provide them. They're an amazing organization. If you haven't heard of them, please check them out, doing amazing things in Wisconsin. And then some of the other organizations, we're using resources from Wisdom, from the Wisconsin League of Women Voters. We met with the Bayview Foundation, who has a large community of color, or that is their community, is a predominantly community of color. We, had a meeting with some of their residents just talking about the importance of voting. NAACP, we are partnering or have partnered on just communication, and we're hosting some forums. We're hosting a forum in the next week and have probably some more partners that we could be adding to the list. So it's varied from organization on us either supporting or them, being a partner and helping us amplify this message.
One other thing, too, that I'd like to mention, too, is that here at FCI, obviously not only working with Kids Forward, but Wisconsin Voices has been a great partner. And, they have just a wealth of information as far as kind of going back to what you said, Winona, about I'm a 501c3, what can I do? What can I do? And things like that. And that's so important because I think some, nonprofit organizations, due to a myriad of reasons, they feel that they can't be involved in kind of pushes like this, and just to remain nonpartisan and just say that we'd like everybody to get out and vote. That's a big thing. But like I said, I can't promote Wisconsin Voices enough. They do great work, and we also have some presentations that they did for us previously through this webinar series on kind of debunking the myths and what you can and cannot do. So just wanted to add that in there as well.
Yeah, no, and I will second, them as being an absolute vital resource and partner here in Wisconsin, a wealth of knowledge around, compliance and 501c3 work. And, I'll add to it that this is probably the most robust electoral advocacy campaign we have done at Kids Forward in quite some time. And there was a lot of learning we had to go through, some of it quickly, and then just really making a commitment as an organization that we needed to play a role or have a role in the electoral process, because the things that we are championing for, that we are advocating, and the communities and families that we are helping, that so much is relying on our elected officials and the tone and the policies they are setting for the state. And if we want to start cracking away at some of these really big issues, that we need to start, changing the outcomes of elections or getting people that can recognize and honor this in elected space. So, I think any organization, it's probably scary at first, but it was a huge learning experience for us. And I think this whole time we've been in communication with Wisconsin Voices, and as you go and you learn how much you can do. So, I mean, we are so excited about this campaign, and I think I'm equally as excited about the next election, because we've learned how many more great things that we can do and really engage and work with citizens in our state. So, but just wrapping up everything you need to know about voting, we're going to plug one of our partner organizations here, Wisconsin League of Women Voters, always the go-to organization about finding out what's on your ballot, some of the issues, what candidates are saying, your polling places. So My Vote Wisconsin, and you can pass that information on to your coworkers, to your family, share it on your social media, get the people that are following you to also pay attention to the election and get the information they need to know to vote. So, and similar to that, I think we just ask that, organizations and individuals pay attention to the issues, pay attention to the racial disparities and the issues related to race here in our state. Then go sign our pledge form. Say you are committed to advancing racial justice here in Wisconsin, and you're going to take that commitment to the polls. Attend forums and ask questions and hold our candidates accountable. There are a lot of organizations and a lot of people that might have closer space to candidates, or of a local organization, and I know there's only a week and a half away, but when you can, learn about what these candidates are doing on these specific issues related to race. And if you have the opportunity, ask an issue that has to do with race when you're in front of a candidate. And then the simple things, maybe not so simple, but the go-to things: make sure you're registered, learn where your polling place is, you can vote early, and then volunteer at or support organizations that are getting people out to vote. And lastly, vote on election day. And then we also ask you to stay, to connect and stay connected to Race to the Polls. You can find us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, visit the website, racetothepolls.org. You can sign the pledge. You can share your story there. And again, this, we're not going to go black on election, the day after election day. We are going to use this campaign to continue talking about race and how it relates to our elected officials, our elections, and public policy here in Wisconsin.
Great, thank you. So just I wanted to interject with a couple. So you had mentioned that obviously, and that's our plan too, is to keep things rolling past November 6th. So do you have how are you going to keep that momentum going?
Well, I think we're going to continue to educate and do policy analysis with a racial equity lens on many of the issues that we talked about briefly earlier, and all the other places that we work on. And we oftentimes send out action alerts and ask people to take action on issues that are very important. I think one of the other things that we hope to do almost immediately after is think about how we get people to think about the census in 2020 and to work to have everyone counted, because that too is extraordinarily important in terms of financial investment and knowing who's in our community and how those resources go. And Winona,
yeah, and another thing that we are really excited about here at Kids Forward is, as many of you may know, will be the budget cycle will will go underway here in Wisconsin, and that is an excellent opportunity for organizations and individuals to start advocating for the issues and the policies that they want to see our elected officials making. So here at Kids Forward, we are already, in partnership with our project, the Wisconsin Budget Project, already working on a proactive agenda for the Wisconsin budget and really getting the word out throughout the state that we should be all on a path to shared prosperity here in Wisconsin, and we should be investing in our families and our communities and making sure we're healthy and we have a strong workforce, and that we are closing some of these tax loopholes and investing in things like schools and infrastructure to, you know, make our state the strongest it can be.
Great. So another quick question with regards to kind of the issue areas that you had all laid out. So do you have any resources or anything like that for, say, candidates that, you know, are leaning towards, strong policies towards Medicaid and, you know, making sure that health emergencies don't, you know, cripple a family, or, you know, you had mentioned about the debate regarding immigration and things like that. Do you have like any resources on those issues areas?
Yeah, so all of the, and we should have mentioned this, I'm sorry, all of the issues that we talked about today you can find these issues in detail on issue guides on racetothepolls.org. So there is one on healthcare, on early education, juvenile justice, and so on, and those have kind of an introduction to the issue and then the policy recommendations that we have been working on for some time. And then I, just also want to encourage people to connect with Kids Forward, kidsforward.net. Our Facebook, we update that quite regularly, and also the Wisconsin Budget Project. Both of these, all of us, for the past several months and kind of forever, we have been putting out information on Medicaid expansion, on healthcare, on taxes, and we will be releasing some really, I think, big issue more in detail.
Driver's license.
Yeah, in before the election. So, connect with us, sign up for our email list, go on our Facebook, follow us on Twitter. All of our projects have social media accounts, and then you can get more information on these particular issues and share that information with candidates.
Great. This was great information, and in that follow-up email that I had referenced earlier, that's going to contain where you can actually review this presentation, view it at your leisure, and share some of the resources. Obviously, we'll share some links that Winona and Erica did mention as well throughout their presentation. Just wanted to thank everyone for joining in the presentation, for interacting, asking questions. I don't think this discussion could have gone as well as it did without everybody kind of pitching in and things like that. So thanks to everybody. We really appreciate you kind of taking a proactive approach and kind of asking any questions. Also wanted to shout out a special thanks to Winona, Erica, and obviously Kids Forward for putting Race to the Polls together, and the hard work that they did, they are doing, and that they're going to continue to do, and that we're all going to continue to do, like I said, following November 6th. So like I said, I'll be sending out an email probably early next week with all of these resources, including the webinar slides and things like that. And one last note, just from an FCI perspective, we do have a hashtag nonprofits Yes You Can page on our website that has a lot of the resources that we talked about. The My Vote page, which lists or gives you information on where your polling place is, if you're registered or not, what you need to do to get registered, because you can register same day, what you need to bring along with you to do that. These presentations, like I had mentioned previously, the ones that we've done with Wisconsin Voices, one from Nonprofit Vote. So, and that will also be included in the follow-up email that I had referenced earlier. So just wanted to thank everybody again for joining us. us. I know you guys are all super busy towards this time of the year. We really appreciate you taking the time, staying engaged and everything like that. Have a great day. Get out.
Well, thank you,
vote.
Tom. The shout out goes back at you guys at FCI and you for all your hard work and inviting us to talk about this campaign. So thank you.
Yeah, it was our pleasure.
Everybody vote.
Yes, for sure. I can't
Vote.
Thank you, everyone.
and bring someone with you.
Yes, exactly. All right. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.